And welcome back to America Right Now. I'm Tom Basili. The pandemic has presented us with a long list of constitutional and legal questions that go to the heart of protecting American freedom. Forces are using the pandemic to fundamentally change this country, and we can't let them. To discuss more of those legal landmines that have been exposed over the last year, we welcome Thane Rosenbaum, Distinguished University Professor at Touro Law School, and Ken Belkin, Civil Rights and Constitutional Law Attorney. He has firsthand experience of fighting these lockdowns in court. Thane, let me talk to you first. When I saw $50 billion for surveillance in the spending bill that just got signed, I got very nervous. The death of privacy in America is a significant threat to freedom, and it seems that the pandemic has thrown fuel on that fire. Your thoughts on the growing surveillance state?
You're right, Tom. Look, I have this Apple Watch. It's a really great device, and the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, recently said that when the history of this era is written, it won't be the phone that everybody remembers, it's the watch. Given the cozy partnership between big tech and this administration, this watch tells me not just my EKG, but if I fall down. And you can imagine on the theory, on the justification of contact tracing, right? This could be another example of a different version of the CCTV issues that we've had here in New York, which is the constant monitoring with television surveillance cameras. So contact tracing is going to be a big issue going forward because we know that the vaccine doesn't deal with the variants, and we're being told to be concerned about the variants. So I think surveillance and monitoring is going to be an ongoing issue.
Mm-hmm. And we also know that it really doesn't work because we actually don't know how many people have the virus to begin with, since so many people have no symptoms and don't even realize they have it. Ken, it seems that there has been at least some affirmation in the courts that government needs to be very careful about infringing on freedom of religion. We've had a number of churches win their cases to open up. But private enterprise has suffered dramatically in the courts. You're involved in lawsuits on behalf of 74 New York City restaurants right now. Talk to us about curtailing the government's power to essentially take away somebody's businesses without compensation.
So we're actually up to about 80 now, and we filed this lawsuit, and shortly after, the governor announced he was reopening. We at 25% in New York City. We then filed a motion requesting that the court order these restaurants allowed open at a minimum of 50%, which is what they need to survive. That motion was denied Tuesday night, and the next day, Governor Cuomo announced 50% in New York City. A lot of coincidences have plagued this lawsuit. But the fact of the matter is, business owners have rights. We all have rights. We have something known as due process rights, meaning that if they're going to take away certain rights to property, we have to be provided with notice, a fair hearing to arbitrate these disputes, and for these business owners' concerns to be aired. They also have the right to equal protection under the law, meaning that we can't have separate restrictions specifically for New York City, where they're not, at one point, they were not allowed to open at all, when the county next to it, Nassau County, was allowed to open at 50%. Sometimes it would be the difference between crossing the street and going to a restaurant across the street. And more importantly, most importantly, we have something known as the takings clause in the Fifth Amendment, meaning if the government takes your property, they can take your property, but you must be fairly compensated for it. In my lawsuit, I have argued that these restaurant owners have had their property taken, and there is a long line of cases that say when a business is deprived the right to do business, it is a taking. Now, the state has argued that these are not permanent takings. These are temporary takings. Well, we're a year into this. At what point does it become permanent?
Yeah. Oh, look, I mean, even if they take part of your property, so if the state comes in and says, well, we want to take a certain piece of your property, but not all of your property, they still have to compensate you for it. So do you, Ken, just real quick, do you see these types of lawsuits popping up all across the country?
They undoubtedly are going to pop up all across this country. There's been multiple in New York State. There's been several in California that I'm aware of, and I'm sure in other jurisdictions. But really, California and New York place the most onerous restrictions on these business owners. And the problem is, at the district court level, at the
Yeah.
lower court level, they are not inclined to question the actions of these governors, and they're not inclined to overrule the actions of these governors.
So this has got to be raised up to
noted,
the federal level or to the Supreme Court. That's where these are heading, right?
yes, eventually a couple of these cases are going to make it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has already showed a willingness to overrule the case that most of these lower court rulings are based on.
Okay. Thane, vaccine and COVID testing passports, requirements to have papers on you to travel or to go places. This is going to be all the rage now with these, particularly with these liberal governors. Andrew Cuomo was talking about people having a QR code that could get scanned when they go places. It's kind of smacks a little bit of what the Chinese are doing, what they used to do in Soviet Russia. Do you believe those types of things are going to be, are constitutional?
Well, remember, Tom, even the question of mandating the vaccine hasn't really come up yet, right? We haven't really seen whether people raise religious objections to taking the vaccine. Can the government actually force you to take it? Look, courts historically have been very defers to the elected branches of the government when it comes to determining what are national emergencies, what's a national crisis. You know, there's very broad powers of emergency powers. Congress has the necessary and proper clause. The Commerce Clause is involved in economic activity and interstate commerce, which again, I think affects restaurants because their food comes usually from interstate. But yes, this is going to be an ongoing question, but the standard is always one of duration, right? Mm-hmm. How long must it be? Is it indefinite? Remember, during World War II, the curfew did apply to Japanese Americans. The internment was never considered valid by the Supreme Court, but the curfew was. And I think you're right, although we've seen the Supreme Court take a position more recently with respect to religious liberty for religious services. Remember, New York and California issued complete bans on religious services, and the Supreme Court invalidated that.
Right.
But historically, the courts defer to the elected branches, and I think that is of some concern.
Yeah, the interesting question is whether or not at this point, with the data that we have and a more than 99.7% survivability rate, whether or not these constitutional freedoms can continue to be infringed upon because the government says that it's an emergency. We have a lot more to talk about on this issue, and we'd love to have you both back. Ken Belkin, keep us up to speed on that lawsuit. Thane Rosenbaum, of course, thank you for your insights.
Anytime,
Tom. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, we'll go inside the fight to reopen